What if the Bible isn't some dusty old book telling us how to live and ruin our fun? What if it actually unfolds a story, an epic story of love and redemption centered in the person of Jesus? A story that not only demands our attention, but our allegiance. This story alone makes sense of everything we see and encounter in the world today. This story is true. This story is life-changing. This is the Good News Story. We've been seeing in this story of God, the God who reveals himself to us in this book, the Bible. And we've now come to a large section known as the Old Testament Scriptures. In these 39 books, we see that the God who created us with a good design and purpose in a good world, though we have rejected him, he has not rejected us. And I'm so thankful that the loving Creator, who rightly shows himself to be wrathful toward our sin, is determined to turn the evil and suffering we have caused into good for his ultimate glory. And right in the midst of Genesis chapter 3, after the man and the woman had scorned their blessing and chosen the curse of living apart from God, God himself gives this promise and prophecy in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. It says, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." God is speaking to the serpent here, Satan, and declaring what he will do. The humans can do nothing to make things right. There's no hope in us. So God sets his plan of redemption into motion. In Genesis 3:15, we see God's promise of a redeemer, a promised deliverer, who would be the offspring, or literally the seed of the woman, which is a very odd thing to say. See, the Hebrews always spoke of the seed or offspring of the man. That's how genealogies were kept. But this one bypasses men altogether, almost hinting at a virgin birth. This offspring of the woman, born in the ordinary way, would be sent to save us from the curse of sin, Satan, death, and hell. So we see in this verse that the crushing of the serpent comes at real personal cost to the one inflicting the blow. The serpent strikes the heel of the Redeemer, killing him. A dying Redeemer does not seem like much of a promise until you see that in the Redeemer's death, his heel comes down to crush the serpent's head. God then, in that chapter, rejects the man and woman's attempts to cover themselves with fig leaves, which is the earliest attempt at religion by humans to provide for themselves a covering to make themselves acceptable to God. Instead, God himself kills an innocent animal, shedding its blood, and then he covers the man and the woman. And in light of where the Bible goes from here, it's impossible not to see an early prefiguring of Jesus, a picture of the innocent one who would die, that we might be covered with his righteousness in order that we would be able to return into the presence of God. So this promised Redeemer would set things right and restore the relationship with himself that was fractured and lost when through one man sin entered the world. We see that God is a pursuing God. the one offended sets about to pursue us, that we might be restored to a right and good relationship with the God who is love. So Genesis 3 truly is our story, and God sends his own son Jesus on a rescue mission for his lost people. As we follow the Bible story onward from Genesis 3 to the end of the Old Testament scriptures, we see the hopeless state of sinful creatures who have rebelled against their Creator. In fact, right in the next generation, the very next chapter in Genesis 4, we see murder, one brother of another. The broken vertical relationship with God leads to a broken horizontal relationship with others. And it doesn't take long before things quickly descend into such a state that the whole human race is all but annihilated in the flood. And then right after the flood, Noah gets drunk, and down we go again, as we see the human race just spiral down in its continual evil bent towards sin. From one generation to the next, the people continue to forget about their Creator, forget about their design, and we see them stuck in sin and darkness. And then, in the midst of the seemingly hopeless darkness, God in mercy calls out a man, Abram, whose name is later changed to Abraham. And he goes on to be the father of the patriarchs of the faith. But when you actually look at the patriarchs, they're not such a wonderful bunch. By the time you get to the third generation, talk about a dysfunctional family. One man sleeping with his daughter-in-law. Of course, that was a case of mistaken identity because he really thought she was a prostitute. And then you have another man. He was sleeping with one of his father's wives. And then you have brothers selling another brother into slavery. And that was just because they didn't murder him, which was their original intent. And eventually, this family grows into a nation. But because of their ever-increasing size, the kingdom of Egypt ends up seeing them as a threat, so they become slaves to the Egyptian Pharaoh. But God shows himself faithful to what has now become, for the most part, a faithless people. And he raises up a deliverer, Moses, to rescue them from slavery. But are they pleased with God's promise of deliverance? At the first sign of opposition, they're convinced God is some manipulator and they would be better off as slaves in Egypt under Pharaoh. When with a mighty hand, God brings them across the Red Sea. He appears to Moses in thunder and lightning and glorious splendor. So what do? They erect a golden calf to worship. God gives the law and to show us we could not earn our way back to him. And within it, he gives pictures to teach and to point to the coming Redeemer, the promised Messiah, as our only hope. But even then, things go into such a downward spiral with endless idolatry, cycles where God intervenes again and again, raising up a judge or a prophet, until by the end of the book of Judges, you can scarcely read those chapters when children are present. We keep reading the repeated phrase, "In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did that which was right in their own eyes." Then God eventually gives him a king after his own heart. And this shepherd turned king starts out well. He's anointed by Samuel the prophet. He kills a lion and a bear with his bare hands. He slays a giant with a sling and a stone. Maybe he's the promised offspring. Maybe he's the snake crusher. Sure, I guess he danced almost naked in the streets. That was a little weird. But then what happens? He commits adultery and arranges the murder of his most loyal soldier to cover up his sin. I mean, if this is a man after God's own heart, what does one not passionate about God look like? One quickly gets the impression that the only thing that stops God from completely wiping out the human race is his covenant promise. You just can't read the Old Testament wisely unless you see it rooted in the fall. This is the plight of mankind. This is the burden we bear because we're sinners by nature and sinners by choice. The curse of God is upon us and we deserve it. It's because of God's mercies that we're not consumed. And some people actually say about the Old Testament scriptures, well, God is a bit harsh with all those judgments, isn't he? Are you kidding? It's not for nothing that the Bible keeps saying God is slow to anger, plenteous in mercy. For apart from God's promise and dramatic intervention again and again, we'd be obliterated. But the other side of the story is that God does intervene. The very one we offended sets about to conquer sin, Satan, death, and hell. The Old Testament scriptures continue to point to the Redeemer, the coming offspring, in direct promises and prophecies. And additionally, God wove pictures of the promised Redeemer into the law and into history. Throughout the Old Testament scriptures, God continues to open up a view of this offspring, this seed, this promised deliverer, the Messiah who will come. For every wanderer, for every pilgrim, for every perplexed soul, for every grieving sinner, the answer has been the same through the ages. Look to the promise of the Christ of God, the Messiah. Throughout the Old Testament scriptures, Jesus has told us, it is written of him, his suffering, leading to his redemptive work on the cross and his entering his glory. And this glory speaks of his resurrection and ascension as king, setting up his kingdom of righteousness, which will never end. When you read from Exodus about God sending Moses as a deliverer to free his people, Israel, do you rejoice only in seeing a people redeemed from physical slavery? Or do you have exceeding joy in the picture that it portrays of another deliverer greater than Moses? Is not your joy in seeing that which the Exodus points, the ultimate and better Passover lamb, the ultimate and better redemption from the far worse slavery of sin and death under a far worse dark lord than Egypt's Pharaoh? When you read of the kingdom established under Solomon, do you rejoice along with the Queen of Sheba in seeing the fame and glory and wisdom of this king and the temple he had built? Or do you have exceeding joy in the picture it portrays of a greater than Solomon, whose name is above all names, who is all wise, and who in great glory has built a house for God with living stones to the praise of the glory of his grace? All of God's eternal purposes have their focal point and their culmination in the person and work of Jesus. God's Son is both the subject and the object of all biblical revelation. Jesus himself underscored this when he admonished the Bible scholars of his own day, "You search the scriptures, for in them you think you have eternal life. And these are they which testify of me. But you are not willing to come to me, that you may have life." We find this in John's Gospel account, chapter 5, verses 39 to 40. So how did Jesus instruct his own followers to approach Scripture? Why, he said to them, "These are the words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all things must be fulfilled which were written in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms concerning me," in Luke 24:44. And then Jesus goes on to show us how to interpret the Old Testament scriptures when he talked with the two despondent disciples along the Emmaus road. And he said, "O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken." And beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. It's clear that the Bible tells one main story, and the unity of that story is only perceived from the standpoint of the story's conclusion or goal, the promised Messiah, Jesus. Well, we've put together a number of additional teaching videos to help you go more in depth in the Old Testament portion of the story. And I'd encourage you to go through them in order that you might see and read this large portion of our Bible through the lens of the fulfillment that's found in Jesus. In these videos, my hope is that you will delight yourself in the pictures and prophecies that God has woven into the history of Israel, all moving the story towards the ultimate hope, bound up in Jesus and the redemption that He would accomplish in the pursuit of sinners like you and like me.